Ever since Game of Thrones took over the world during its 8 seasons, most shows have tried to replicate that same success, and the Netflix adaptation of the highly acclaimed book and video game series of The Witcher was no exception with its first season. And in this video, I want to talk about how the success of Game of Thrones affected the industry and how that craze to create the next world captivating show has basically resulted in a worst artistic product in some cases, especially in the case of the Netflix adaptation of the aforementioned Witcher. But before we dive in, if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel as it helps out a great deal. But now onto the video. When it comes to me personally, I have read the first two books in the series of The Witcher, and I have also played all three games, and The Witcher 3 is probably one of my favorite games of all time. But when it came to the show itself, I didn't really have a lot of expectations towards it when I first heard about it. But when we're talking about The Witcher, as I mentioned before, we have to talk about Game of Thrones. And when it comes to Game of Thrones, one of the basic points of why people love that show so much were the characters themselves. And when it came to the show itself, after I think the fifth season, if I'm correct, the tone of it has changed since it ran out of the source material itself, and they have changed the show into a fantasy show with dragons, or just having a main focus on the fantasy elements. Whereas prior to that, those elements of dragons and stuff, they were minor but yet integral parts of the story itself. Now, when it comes to The Witcher as a story itself, or just when we talk about the first two books, as of course the first season of the show was adapted from the first two books, The Witcher was always a rather small story in the scale of things, or at least the first two books, as of course that was the story of Geralt of Rivia, and the story was a really personal one to Geralt, and what struck me the most when I read the first two books, or just played the games in general, which are kind of extensions of the books themselves, is the fact that the story has a ton of moral grays in it, and it made the story for me rather contemplative and thought-provoking by nature at the same time, which is kind of interesting because The Witcher 3 was this huge, massive success which brought people into the world of The Witcher itself, and of course it had a lot of subtle subtext instead of whacking you in the head with its messages that it was trying to convey in general, and this is why a lot of people I think gravitated towards the universe because of these very things that it kind of mirrored our reality, even now or even back in the day, like 20, 30 years ago when they were written, if I'm correct. But when it comes to the games themselves, I think that they adapted this kind of formula of moral grayness or the unique identity of the Witcher series rather well, while they also added a touch of this Lord of the Rings style epicness or just epic storytelling to it, especially in the third game as the story went along, but the story still remained a very personal one at its core. But when we are talking about the Witcher show and adaptation in general, my approach to that is that a certain level of wiggle room or artistic freedom is needed to adapt to a different medium to kind of preserve what the source material tried to convey what it actually was. So I don't think it is reasonable to expect a one-to-one recreation of the same thing, because usually when we're translating art to a different medium, a lot of beats don't necessarily work as well as they did originally, so you have to take a bit of artistic freedom here and there, but that was of course not one of the things that I would judge the show on, first of all. Well, when I watched the first episode, my thoughts were that the show really started on a strong foot. And why I like that first episode so much and why I think a lot of people enjoy that probably the most out of the season is because it was kind of this one-to-one adaptation of that short story in the books. And it was really close to what The Witcher actually was, to its unique identity as a series. But as the rest of the season went on, I felt like that the more we went on with the plot and the story, the more it lagged the identity of the Witcher itself. The show has turned into this rather generic and mass appeal fantasy series. And of course, as I mentioned before, the source material, which were the first two books for the first season, they were not made to be mass appeal books. As I mentioned before, they deal with a lot of serious issues regarding racism, xenophobia, sexism, and so on. And same goes for the games, as they have kind of adapted that. And when I talk about, or when I think about the world of The Witcher, I always consider that to be a heavily adult-orientated fantasy setting, even though they were probably written for teenagers, kind of in the same vein of something like Star Wars, but there's kind of a lot of profanity for that in The Witcher and a lot of focus on the aforementioned things like racism, xenophobia, sexism, and so on, but with a lot of subtle subtext in it. But when it comes to the show itself and the plot of the show, a lot of changes were made from the books, and they were kind of loosely used for the plot of the first season, but they were rather used for kind of the skeleton of the first season itself. So they weren't necessarily adapted from them, but they were kind of used as the basis of what the plot would be for the first season. And I think when it comes to one of the biggest problems with the series itself, or the first season I should say, is that Geralt is not necessarily the main protagonist of the show, as he's only one of 3 major protagonists within the show itself, and that, as I mentioned before, was a major mistake, because of course Geralt is the Witcher himself, so, the show should focus around him, but what they did well in that case is that the show focuses on him and his relationship with the other 2 main protagonists, or the other characters. The other characters being Yennefer and Ciri, and they are given much bigger roles than in the books, as they are basically just the other 2 protagonists of the series. And we even witness the origins for some of these characters, and mainly referring to Yennefer. And to me, that always signaled that the show was always wanted to be this more character-focused, trying to emulate this Game of Thrones style of storytelling, or that success, as I mentioned before, instead of being its own thing and just trying to follow in the footsteps of what the books and the games have so successfully established when it comes to the world and the unique identity of The Witcher. And this has always rubbed me in the way that they were trying to please everyone with the series and to present people a character that you could identify with. Because of course, when we're talking about Geralt, he's a male adult, and Yennefer is a female adult, and Ciri is a young child when you really think about it. So you have a lot of kind of diversity of how people can relate to these characters and how many people can actually relate to these characters. Like every kind of segmentation has a point of identification within the show itself. But I felt like that they were trying to please everyone so hard, but in the end, the show ends up pleasing no one, as it has no real unique identity as the books and the games did. And one of the biggest examples that stuck out to me most was the Battle of Sodden Hill within the book and within the show. As when we are talking about the book version of it, Geralt is hurt and hallucinating as he's kind of reliving the battle itself, as the battle was told by the legends or just folklore in general, as of course he wasn't there to begin with, and it is told in these flashback sections within the book. But in the show itself, this told us this epic last stand and huge battle to, I think, again, to emulate Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings as well, instead of just kind of sticking with what the second book did, or just trying to create something completely new from how the book approached that, trying to create something completely new out of it. But to me, and why I especially appreciate the Witcher games, for example, so much more than, is that I think the Witcher 3 structure was the perfect blueprint to achieve a balance between being a generic kind of this epic fantasy world, if you will, and still having a unique identity of its own with a lot of moral grayness. But looking towards season 2, I really hope that the show will be a bit braver and place a bigger emphasis on the moral complexities of the worlds within The Witcher, while also making the world and story more unique, honoring the source material at the same time, and hopefully it will take some notes from CD Projekt Red as well. Thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you have enjoyed it. And if you did so, please leave a like, as it helps out the channel a great deal. And let's talk some Witcher. What did you think about the games? What did you think about the books? What did you think about the series? And what are your expectations for season 2? And I'll see you in the next one. And until then, remember to keep it insightful.